I'm Tom Reid, and with me today is Kim Corrier from Reid Consulting Group as well. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to you today about licensing the fabric and what on earth is the fabric and why should you care? So to start with, who is CostQuest? Because they're the people you're actually going to license the fabric from. It all kind of starts with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They licensed with private company CostQuest Associates to create the fabric. They've done other things for the FCC. The Connect America cost model is a big multi-year endeavor. A fabric development is probably even bigger in terms of contract value. So why do we need the fabric? One of the things that's been really surprising to me is just how unreliable address information is. We've worked in a number of different states, and we're working with things like E911 addresses, but we find the quality is extremely varied. A lot of states collect that data county by county, and each county has a different flavor of it. The county I live in, they gave E911 addresses to every campsite in state parks. Other places, they didn't even put in the name of the city. So extremely varied. So we end up with basically no single source of truth. And that's what the FCC has attempted to do with the fabric. So they contracted with the CostQuest. CostQuest has it's obviously a proprietary process, but it's a combination of doing things like processing satellite images, trying to match them up with property records, so that with the goal of identifying all broadband serviceable locations, so BSL. And we'll get into the definition of a BSL later. The intent here is to have an accurate physical service location for all residential and small business locations. Location accuracy has been a really big issue. And as I mentioned, the E911 address information, you'll see in this picture, the red dots are E911 addresses in an area of Ohio. And here we are at the end of the driveway. Similar process here. What we actually wanted and what CostQuest has been striving to produce is where actually are those service points. So you'll see here that we've got an E911 at the end of the driveway. CostQuest plunked a dot down right on top of the house. So they did a good job with that. Same here where the driveway and the house are distant. This is really important for people doing planning because they need to know where the actual service location is. As you get into more rural areas, you can end up some pretty long driveways. This hasn't been a perfect process at all, and we'll get into some of those imperfections as well. But generally, we've found the CostQuest data to be pretty accurate. So the mystery of the fabric, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an eye chart. When we say the fabric, it's a CSV. So it's a spreadsheet with a lot of rows of information in it. And you'll see here, I blocked out what the actual address is because of the licensing restrictions that we'll get into in more detail. But there's some really critical data fields here. One of them is the location ID. So the location ID is what all the grant programs are going to use. It's what all the challenge processes are going to use moving forward. When we participated in a big grant program in the state of Ohio last year, it was pre-fabric. So we were using E911 addresses. The contractor that the state of Ohio had was using some other address source, and about half of the addresses didn't line up. So the location ID is going to become kind of the approach. Probably most state programs too, but definitely the federal programs are going to be focused on this location ID. So each location has a unique ID. You'll see the unit count and the building type. The unit count, so each location, each row is a location. The unit count tells you how many units there are at that location. So if it's a duplex, it should say 2. If it's a 4-apartment building, it should say 4, and so forth. So that's how you get a combination of where are the physical locations and how many potential subscribers are in that area. The building type, it's interesting to consider. It's not particularly important. But then you get into latitude and longitude. So that's the other two key items. We get the location ID, the latitude and longitude, and how many units are there. And from that, you can determine a lot about, what's the likely household population there, how much money you might be able to generate if you're a service provider, and so forth. So you see this BSL flag here too. In that active file, they give you an active and an inactive file once you license for it. The active file is really the only thing to pay attention to at this point. And so the BSL flag will be true in anything that's considered active. So what is a BSL, a broadband serviceable location? It's a business or residential location where they're projecting there'd be a demand for mass market fixed broadband. So that's really the goal there. The residential BSLs should include all residential structures, housing groups, and so forth, apartment buildings. And then the business BSLs are businesses, nonprofits that are expected, again, to use mass market services. And this is a really critical distinction, is the mass market services like you would buy from a Spectrum, and you see their price list of what the different packages cost versus an enterprise grade internet access. So large healthcare providers, a lot of libraries, a lot of big businesses, they don't consume the broadband from the mass market. They buy off of business service lists that they negotiate directly with the carriers. So all of the BSLs, the focus there is on locations likely to go into the mass market sort of market. Examples of BSLs: single family home, an apartment or condo, college dorms, other types of group quarters. Might be a mixed use building. We've got retail on the lower level, apartments above. Probably all of those are going to be BSLs. And a building that houses multiple businesses. So you might have a building that has a restaurant, a clothing store, and daycare center. And you'll see what they've tried to do, and these methodologies have changed a little bit over time. So here you see this apartment complex. The idea is to have one location, multiple units. So here's a location, then maybe there's 10 units in that. So that is what you should see in the data, is here's this location and there's 10 units there, and then each of these buildings would have that. This has been an area of kind of inconsistency in CostQuest's fabric, is sometimes you'll see green dots on each one of these residences instead of just a green dot on the building. So there's still some difficulties there in parsing this data. They do keep improving it, but it's still the framework that everyone's going to be using. So there are also structures that are not broadband serviceable locations. So for instance, alternate dwelling units, like your RV that's sitting in your backyard. Sorry, that's not going to qualify as a BSL. The barns, stables, and standalone garages, that's been another tough area for them, is they look at a parcel and there might be 5 buildings on that parcel. One is the farmhouse. The other 4 are outlying buildings. And sometimes it's hard for them to get the dot on the household instead of a big outbuilding. Then there's also this question in a lot of agricultural areas about, well, hey, no, wait a second. That outbuilding is a large chicken facility, and we actually need broadband there. So it kind of cuts both ways. There are areas that we kind of wish they'd put more dots, and they have or have not, based on how active your state has been in trying to add places. So I listed chicken coops there, but actually large chicken operations, they might be reasonable BSL. So this has been a back and forth process with the states, the FCC, and CostQuest about how to define BSLs, and there's a whole challenge process to try to add locations or change the definition of a location. But what we're talking about is primarily consuming this data not trying to change the data. So getting this data and using it for your purposes of broadband planning. So empty lots, they don't want to include businesses that they project are going to subscribe to enterprise class services. This has been another gray area. It's like, okay, here's this clinic and there's only 4 doctors and 12 nurses there. Is that enterprise grade or is that commercial mass market grade? How exactly you draw that line has been another point of controversy with CostQuest. And then most of the community anchor institutions are not showing up in the fabric. Some of them are if they're fairly small. Again, it's a dividing line that has not been real clear. Most of them are not in there because they're considered to be large enough that they would be buying directly commercial types of services rather than mass market. So the fabric license that you'll need to get, it's intended to cover all locations in the United States and gives us that standardized list of locations that's so important. You apply for your license based on a specific geographies of interest. So if you're a county entity, you apply for that county's addresses. If you're a state entity and so forth, if you have a council of government with 6 counties in it, you can apply for all 6 counties. But they aren't just going to give you the whole fabric. They're going to require that you justify the geography. So there's different tiers. I believe pretty much everybody on this call will be looking at Tier 4. These are entities. Tier 4 licenses are for entities that are not broadband service providers and are not government entities. There are 2 types of Tier 4, the standard agreement. So you use that to file challenges, and you cannot use it for actually filing into the broadband data collection process. And then the research license. This is where you might be an organization that does research on broadband. You can apply for a research license over just about any geography, but you cannot then issue challenges. You don't have standing to issue challenges. So you don't want to do the research license if you have any interest in participating in the challenge process. So there's 3 steps to license a fabric. The first is you have to establish yourself in the FCC core system. So FCC Commission registration system is called CORS. So if you don't already have a CORS account, you have to establish one. It's pretty easy. And then you need to create an FRN, an FCC registration number for your organization. Again, it's pretty easy, happens very quickly, not a long lag time to do either of these steps, but it is the first required step. Now, if you already have a CORS account, you already have an FRN, you can obviously skip that. Second, then you have to register in the FCC broadband data collection system. And then you have to request the CostQuest Tier 4 license. So we'll step through each of these in more detail. And there's a link you can go to get much more confusing instructions about how to do this. So that first step, the core system and creating your FRN, basically just go to the CORS website and establish your FRN for your entity. You do not, when you're selecting your entity type, you do not want to say you're an individual because individuals cannot license the fabric. So once you've completed that step, then you go to another FCC website, the Broadband Data Collection System, the BDC, to log into that with your CORS username and password. So it's the same username and password, but it's a different system. And then you should see the FRN that you just established and any other FRNs that are already associated with that username. So you click on that FRN and that you want the fabric data set, and then the entity information page in the BDC pops up, and there's a lot of information. You have to describe your entity, provide its address, phone number, contact information, email address, all that kind of stuff in the BDC system. And you're going to select the bulk crowdsource / challenge data option, that's what you're seeking. And then C is going to CostQuest and actually asking for the license. So you've submitted all that information in the BDC. The FCC is going to review it. Shouldn't be a problem. They pass it on to CostQuest. CostQuest then emails whoever signed up for it that, hey, here's a link to ask for it. You need to then create your user account in the CostQuest portal. Totally separate user account, different username, different password. So you create your CostQuest account, and then you complete the Tier 4 submission form. So it's a little redundant with the BDC. The BDC, you had to explain who you are. Now you're going to have to do the same thing again to CostQuest. And this is where you'll also justify to CostQuest about the geographic area of interest. So then CostQuest will review and validate. And usually that goes pretty smoothly. We've had some cases, though, where CostQuest has not been very agreeable. A lot seems to depend on who you get. A number of different people that review these things, and some of them are real sticklers, and some of them just want to get the work done. So they'll review and validate, and then they'll email a license agreement to you to do e-signature. Then once you've returned that, you'll get an email that links you to that data file of the actual fabric, which again is just a CSV with fabric ID, address, lat long, and so forth. And they will continue sending emails every time they update the fabric. They release a new version of it. They'll send you another link to it for as long as your license is valid. There's no cost for this. For a Tier 4 license, there's no cost to get that. No maintenance cost to it. It's just a free license, but it is a pretty interesting license as well. So getting those license issues, really read this license carefully. It's really kind of a nasty license. I'm really kind of surprised that the FCC I guess I shouldn't be that surprised that the FCC negotiated out such a unfavorable license to licensees. Sorry about the dog. So there's a lot of restrictions about with whom and how you can share. Bottom line here is you can't share it with the public. Like I could not in this webinar show you license data from CostQuest. I can show you little examples of it, but I can't share, oh, this is what it looks like in the state of Ohio. I would be violating the license. Now, if you're a licensee, I can share it with you. If you're not a licensee, I can't share it with you. So this is a real difficult point, especially for councils of government and county governments, right? We want to be open. We want to share all this information. You cannot. And there's pretty significant teeth in the agreement. There's another one is the CostQuest license extends to cover your analysis and all processes. So like we have a complex mapping process. If we use that fabric data in our mapping process, they own our process. And we are basically a licensee of our own process. So really important then to touch the license last. So we do all of our analysis and then we project it. We do a spatial join onto the fabric as the last step in our process so that CostQuest doesn't own our intellectual property and how we did the mapping. So I suggest you try to hit the license last in any analysis that you do with it. But the location ID is going to be the basis of all BEAD proposals, challenges, and awards. So it's pretty important to get it if you want to try to participate in any way in the BEAD program. So why is a fabric important to us? States will be conducting their pre-challenge modifications And if you're curious about your state's pre-challenge modifications, go to the BEAD Initial Plan Volume 1. If you're curious about how bureaucratic things can be, there's a BEAD Initial Plan Volume 1 and a BEAD Initial Plan Volume 2. I've seen these as long as 300 pages. I've seen them as short as about 100 pages between the two volumes. So it's a lift. What you're specifically looking for are how are they going to do pre-challenge modifications. Once they've completed pre-challenge modifications based on what NTIA eventually approves, then they're going to publish a list of eligible locations, and it's going to be fabric IDs, those location IDs. So that's what the state's going to publish to say, here we go, these are the areas that we think are eligible. Some states aren't making any pre-challenge modifications. They're just taking whatever the FCC map says, and they're going to publish those location IDs, and that's it. Other states are being pretty aggressive. They're doing things like saying, gosh, if DSL is the highest speed service there, we're going to downgrade that. Or, hey, we're going to use speed test mapping to determine eligibility. So it starts with the FCC maps, goes through this process, but at the end of pre-challenge modifications is when the state will say, here are the areas we think are eligible. Then there's going to be a BEAD challenge process. Most likely, most states are going to require that you use a location ID to do that. That process is also in your state's BEAD Initial Plan Volume 1. And then you're going to apply for grant proposals based on the fabric location IDs. It kind of makes sense. Addresses are such a problem that we're going to use these location IDs. But again, you need the location IDs to be able to process it. So I'll give you an example. The FCC maps are still really bad. This is Athens County, one of the Appalachian counties in Ohio. It's my home as well. And you'll see that the broadband situation in Athens County based on maximum speed tests are still quite bad. We're focused on the two shades of red and the orange. So you'll see this deep red area, a little bit lighter red. Those are both below 25.3. And then the orange is above 25.3, but below 50.10. This is the FCC version of reality, looking at all technologies. So if your state is going to use the FCC map unchanged, this is the kind of problem that you're going to see, is the FCC maps are still horribly overstating actual availability. I like the fabric. I think it's a good idea to have these location IDs so we're not all arguing about addresses. But the maps themselves, it's still a trust but never verify. ISP can file anything with FCC and they'll put it on the map and show it as served. But one of the things Ohio says they're going to do, and NTI hasn't approved this yet, but Ohio says they're going to take anything that's fixed wireless and call it underserved. So that would unveil more areas in this county that would be eligible. So these are the wired only. And you see it's still a big discrepancy though. So another thing they can do is downgrade the DSL. That would open up more areas. And of course, you have to block out areas that have already been funded. So these are areas which is interesting. If you look at some of these areas that are funded, they're supposedly served already, yet this is all FCC funding from the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. So at some point, the FCC didn't think these areas were funded. So you'll see these blocked out areas. And then you have to decide where you're going to challenge. The challenge process is too complicated. The BEAD challenge process is too complicated to just say, oh, we'll challenge everything in the county. You really have to try to prioritize based on what you think the state's pre-challenge modifications are going to do. And I focus particularly on this panhandle area, and I'll explain why. So the pre-challenge modifications that are going to happen, each state's broadband office formulates their plan and submits it to NTIA after public comment period. Again, that's initial proposal, volume 1, requirement 7. It proposes the methods for modifying those FCC maps. And so this is where we think it's really important to reverse the burden of proof. We want the states in the pre-challenge modification process to fix most of these mapping problems so that we're not all just running around trying to challenge them. And that's how, again, they will determine the eligible locations and kick off the challenge process. So if you look at Athens County and the vague FCC maps, boy, it's really hard to parse this information. But the darkest color here is showing that 80 to 100% of the households have service they would consider to be broadband. And you'll see up here in this panhandle again, they're making it look like the service is quite strong. So zoom into that panhandle a little bit. And I don't find these maps really useful. You can't kind of see through them at the location IDs. These funny octagons, it just doesn't provide a whole lot of information. What we do with the FCC maps is we download all their data and we display it in different ways so that it's easier to comprehend. So identifying areas to challenge, again, looking at that panhandle, we just in that panhandle of our county, we're convinced, both through our speed test apps and interviews with people who live up there, that the broadband situation there is terrible. FCC shows it as pretty good to excellent. And it's all based on a single cable TV operator that is making these claims that they have great service in the area. And you can interview people in these towns and go, no, it's not true. No, we know they exaggerate like crazy. So this becomes a really key target area for us in our particular county. We know this is a hot point, so we want to focus on it. And so, okay, let's say we want to challenge the BEAD challenge process is going to be based on census block groups. So not census blocks, but the next tier up, census block groups. And you need to find 6 households in a census block group that are willing to participate in the challenge process. So I'd shoot for 10, right? If you need 6, sort of like getting signatures for a ballot initiative, you want to overshoot the requirement. Again, this is one of the reasons I think it's really important to focus. You don't want to try to challenge big geographies. You need to focus on specific census block groups that you care about and that you think are kind of egregious in their overstatements. And so I'm showing you, in this case, E911 addresses. So these are the addresses that I told you before. Yeah, it wasn't really all that accurate in the E911. There were a lot of conflicts. But I can't show you the fabric because I don't know whether you're licensed or not. And so here's an example of this would be too much information for a license agreement to show you fabric data. That's how kind of ridiculous it is in terms of being able to share this data more publicly. But that's what you need to do, is identify the boundaries of the census block group. And then I'm not quite sure how you canvass these people, because in the BEAD challenge process, you have to find the 6 locations. They have to give you a copy of their broadband invoice that shows what they're subscribing to. And then they have to do 3 speed tests on 3 separate days and send you screenshots of those results. So it's a heavy lift. I think if you can explain it to people, they'd be excited to participate because everybody cares about this topic. And it's how do you bridge that gap and actually get to these people in a way that doesn't just seem really threatening? Because the individuals in most state plans, the state of Missouri is trying to let individuals challenge directly. In most state plans I've seen so far, the individual household is required, but then a government entity, council of government, nonprofit, they're the ones who actually have to gather the data and file the challenge with the state. So it's just going to be, it's a lot. And again, another reason to really focus in on the areas that you're most concerned about. So that BEAD challenge process I mentioned, I see it as a David and Goliath kind of thing because there's no funding for it. You want to do this, and there are two classes of challengers: the unfunded consumer advocates. There is no funding stream to support the BEAD challenge process from the consumer advocacy perspective, which I think is kind of outrageous. I know a lot of folks that have been very excited about the broadband topic, and we've been in broadband planning for years now, and people get fatigued with it. So we're asking them to, hey, once more, care about this topic and get involved. Um, so I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you care about this topic. I hope you can garner enough energy to get people to participate in your challenge process. The other folks that will participate in the challenge process are the ISPs themselves. And those ISPs will rebut your challenges and also challenge things that the state did in the pre-challenge modification process. So again, area challenges look to me like the only smart way to go here. That's where you challenge the census block groups and the 6 or more households with multiple speed tests and subscription information. And you're really going to have to target these block groups after projecting the outcome from the pre-challenge modifications. Otherwise, you're just kind of waiting for the state to say, here are the areas here are the addresses we consider eligible, and you're sort of off to the races. So again, important to get that CostQuest fabric license. We reviewed this chart before about the process. So the state initial proposal is the stage we're in right now. They all have to be done by the end of this year. And then the NTIA reviews them, sometimes does some real nitpicky stuff on them. And once the NTIA finishes this review, this is a really key point in time here. And I've marked that as being a few months. Maybe it's a few weeks, maybe it's a few days, but the NTIA review process has to happen. But once that concludes, once we reach this point right there, the challenge window is going to happen fast because the state's going to be all set, ready to do their pre-challenge modifications. They're going to do that as quickly as possible and then publish that and start the challenge window. It's going to happen very quickly after this point, but we don't know quite when that point is, and it's going to vary from state to state. So sorry, but there's a lot of variables in this, and the timing's going to vary, and it's a pretty short window. The reason the states are so urgently pursuing this is from the end of this point here where the NTIA approves their initial proposal to the time they have to finish their final proposal is 1 year. Sounds like a long time, but not with everything they have to do. So they have to do their pre-challenge modifications. They have to do the challenges, adjudicate those challenges, come up with a final list of eligible locations. Then they have to kick off the entire grant process, award all the grants, package that all together, put it out for public comment, and then give it to the NTIA again for this second NTIA review. And then the deployments really kick off. Before that, the deployments are probably just going to be doing things like environmental impact statements and things like that. So not much is going to happen until after the second NTIA review. So this window is tight and somewhat unpredictable. And last thing I'll show you is just actually, this hasn't been updated for a week. Things may have changed. I'll have to go back and look at this again. But you'll see Georgia and Kentucky comments are closed. Georgia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Comment period on volume 1's already closed. Georgia decided to do DSL downgrades. Kentucky decided to do DSL downgrades and speed tests. Now, the comments are closed. That doesn't mean NTIA has approved it yet. Maryland, we don't know anything about yet. Mississippi, comments close in 6 days. So if you want to say anything there, they're going to do DSL downgrade, use speed tests. New York, North Carolina, we don't know anything yet. Ohio is pretty aggressive. They intend to downgrade DSL downgrade fixed wireless and use speed tests. Pennsylvania was saying just speed tests. South Carolina, we don't know yet. Tennessee, Virginia, unfortunately, their intent is to have no pre-challenge modifications. Whatever the FCC map says is what you'll see. And then West Virginia is going to DSL downgrades and speed tests. So that's where we are right now. I'm happy to. Yep.
Before you jump off, when you say that Georgia and Kentucky are doing DSL downgrades, can you spell out exactly what that means?
Sure. What they're doing the DSL downgrade, and I really appreciate this, is the old twisted pair copper that was installed back in the 50s and 60s to bring telephone services into rural areas. That was great. It really made a big difference in rural America. But then the telephone companies decided they're going to try to push digital subscriber line services, broadband across that copper. Well, that didn't start until the 1990s, 2000s. So by that time, that copper was already 30 or 40 years old. Now that copper is 60 to 70 years old, and it's just no longer capable. It's decrepit infrastructure. This is an infrastructure program. So replacing those old decrepit copper is a high priority for most states, saying, yeah, we know that that's dilapidated infrastructure. We want to replace it. So the DSL downgrade is to say any place that DSL is the highest speed service offering, we're going to say it's underserved or unserved. So they'll make it eligible. So the DSL downgrades are really helpful. The licensed fixed wireless, I'm really concerned about that one. The licensed fixed wireless folks, what they do is here's my tower. They draw a 5-mile radius around the tower and say we can serve everything within that 5-mile radius, and it's just not true. I'm really glad Ohio intends to downgrade licensed fixed wireless, but yeah. So the DSL downgrades are pretty commonly accepted. What other questions we have?
So we had some questions in the chat that I've been keeping up with, but Sarah and Sam and the good folks at Connect Humanity have asked me to also share them verbally. One question was, is there a way to easily tell the difference between a single family dwelling and a multifamily dwelling? And the answer to that is, as Tom mentioned, when you receive the fabric data, it should say the number of units in a given location. Again, the system isn't perfect. So if you have boots on the ground knowledge of what that building actually is, and if that's correct or not, that will help you to determine if, number one, how you would treat that location, and number two, if you would want to challenge that location. Part of the challenge process is they do want to earnestly have the fabric be correct, right? So while we mainly think of the challenge process as what's served and what's underserved, if there's other inaccuracies in the fabric information, they do want to hear about that as well. Tom, anything to add there?
Yep, I think you covered it.
Okay. Next question was, what if people live in an RV in a lot in low-income communities? This is the case on the Texas-Mexico border and in other rural communities. And again, I go back to, it's not a perfect system. When they speak about RVs not being a BSL, a broadband serviceable location, they're mainly speaking of if it's considered an alternative dwelling unit. So differentiating between an RV community in a rural area versus someone having an RV sitting in their yard that they use for. Yeah.
I'm not sure it's that fine a grain. What you'd have to do is get the fabric and look at the areas of concern and see, because we have exact same thing. We have people who have even built little foundations around their RV.
Yes.
And that is their residence, and those should be BSLs. So I think you'd have to examine that on a case-by-case basis to see, okay, hey, we know this is true in this area. Let's go look at it and see if they got counted or not.
And so again, this is a situation of, it's not a perfect process. They've tried to do what they can. Some of it is better than other situations. Another question was, when communities are doing planning, that may or may not involve a challenge. Which type of license should they get, research or standard? Tom, I weighed in and said standard is the most likely. That what they're looking for with research is, especially if there's going to be some type of work product that you are producing to share that involves research that you are doing with the information, that's really what the research is for. They listed, for example, higher education institutions doing research from the fabric. And that's what the research is for. The standard is, I think pretty much everybody on this group, unless you are partnering with an institution of higher education that will be doing research, the standard license is the tier 4 that you want. And then the last question, go ahead.
I see a question from Jordan about, do states have to require the DSL under a licensed fixed wireless or request it? Yeah, the states have to do that. State Broadband Office is your source to try to get those downgrades to happen. And it's just so variable from state to state about how they're addressing those topics.
And then the last question that was already answered in the chat was had to do with if states have been successful in the challenge process. And I think it was a really good question, but you asked it early before Tom could get to the fact that we're really not there yet, that we really don't know how successful states are going to be, that there's going to be a considerable amount of variability in how states from state to state handle the challenge process, and then what is considered a successful outcome in their challenge process.
Well, and there's still this question about what NTIA is going to say. So I know state of Ohio has gotten some pushback from NTIA about some of the things they put in volume 1. I thought this could be more of a block grant sort of program where meet these minimum set of requirements, then the states kind of use their own judgment about what to do. It's much more prescriptive, and the NTIA is being kind of heavily involved. So one of the things you can do is, if one of your states is going out for public comment, is to write comments that are supportive. If your state is trying to do things that you think are really good, write supportive comments that they can use with NTIA.
I think that addresses all of the questions that we've had come through. Tom included it in his slide deck, but I'm going to put in the chat a link to the, Tom, what did you call it? The less helpful list of how to, so this is the slightly less helpful, slightly more cumbersome list in of how to apply for the license. One recommendation that I think we would make for folks who are ready to apply for the license is make sure before you start, you have one person designated as the person who you know will be very responsive to their emails. That becomes very important, but maybe also have one person who is sort of the backup for, should something occur that person, the person who is the main, is out of the office for some unanticipated reason. We have a hand raised. I'm going to click on our friend Dakia. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think you're able to speak if you unmute.
Hi, Dakia.
Can you hear us?
Dakia, we're not able to hear you. If you can maybe type your question into the chat.
Or the Q&A. Yeah.
Or the Q&A. Yeah, you've got the permission to talk, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Question in the chat: when should folks get started on getting the license? I would say today.
Yeah, absolutely, immediately. Sometimes the whole process gets completed in 10 days. Other times it gets really gummed up.
don't see any other questions. I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, what about those that have already completed the initial challenge?
I'm not quite sure the context of that one. So
Yeah.
we have one state just in the country, Louisiana, that's actually completed their BEAD challenge process. So they got their initial plan in, NTIA approved it, they did their pre-challenge modifications, ran the challenge process. I think that challenge process closed. Of course, they're not one of our states, so I haven't followed that real closely. Then there have been so many challenge processes. So there's the FCC challenge process where individuals could go in and challenge availability at their locations. There's been challenge processes at a state level for their state programs. So the FCC challenges are an interesting one where individuals submitted it. The state of Missouri took a really creative approach with that. They intend to take all those FCC challenges that were successful and pull them into their own challenge process. And any place they have 6 or more in a census block group to convert that into an area challenge. Because they're saying, hey, look, the FCC already adjudicated this. The carriers already had a chance to rebut it. So we should just accept those as challenges, but we'll go one step further and say, we'll expand that to cover a census block group, a census tract based on how many successful challenges there were. I think that's really, really great step. That's the only state I've seen saying they're going to do that, though.
But it's important to note that unless a state decides they're going to treat the FCC challenges like that, the FCC's challenges really don't have any bearing on the BEAD challenge process.
We see Steve asking, do you encourage individual grantee organizations to obtain their own fabric license or the LCAs or both? If the LCA does it, yeah, that should be fine.
And I think that answers Samantha's question too about will each person in a company organization need a fabric license? I think if the LCAs have the license, then but then again, Tom, if you can explain, they do need to be careful about who the LCAs do need to be careful about who they're sharing the information with once they have the license.
Right. So like we worked with the Missouri Association of Councils of Government, got them a fabric license for the state of Missouri. They can share that with their board of directors, which are the directors of the regional planning commissions, but they can't share that then with, say, some nonprofit that they're associated with. So you have to look at the organizational umbrella. So if your LCA is a council of government and you're a member of that council of government, then you're good. If you're on kind of a related but not really part of the structure of the council of government, then that's not good. You need your own license.
So I'm thinking I saw our friend Annie Stroud from West Virginia on here. You know, she has, I think, 18 states, right? So
18 counties.
18 counties. Yes, I'm sorry, 18 counties. I didn't mean to try to give Annie more work. So in that situation, Tom, she could share if her group had the license, she could share with the counties that she's working with, but it wouldn't be appropriate to push that out to just the general public.
Or to the library or to the Red Cross or
Right.
to any other organization that's not under your actual organizational umbrella. It's a very silly license. I really wish they'd done some public comment periods on what that license should say. Not that the FCC would listen to us, but we at least would have had a chance to get it to be more rational.
So
I haven't heard of any actual enforcement actions yet, but
right.
based on the language, I wouldn't suggest risking it.
Yeah. So I see a private question about sharing with an ISP. And the reality of it is that an ISP should have its own license, and that none of the LCAs in the Accelerator program should share anything with an ISP without.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. The ISP should have no trouble getting the license, although that has also been extremely variable in our experience. So one ISP we work with, I was able to get multiple states because we just said they're considering expanding into those states. They gave us the license for it. In another case, we're dealing with a rural electric cooperative that won grants over about 8 counties, and they're saying we'll only give you fabric for where you actually have service operating today. It's like, well, we just got the grant, just starting to build it out. Why can't we have the fabric addresses? And it's just like, no. So it's a little hit and miss.
So to go back to the previous question, I think everyone should apply for their license starting today. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat or in the Q&A, and I don't see, I apologize if I'm missing anybody, but I don't see anyone's hand raised. I think Sarah was going to pop, there she is. Sarah's going to pop in and wrap us up.
Thanks, Kim and Tom. Any other final words?
No, just try to avoid the broadband fatigue. I realize it's difficult. This next 12 months is going to be really important when we get the pre-challenge modifications and then the BEAD challenge process and then the whole grant process. County governments and other such entities, most states are going to have points associated with which ISP you're supporting. So it's not kind of in the old days, everybody just write letters of support for multiple applications. The BEAD program is specifically expecting you as a county entity to do something like a resolution and say, we're supporting this application, not supporting 6 applications. We're supporting this one. So you're putting your thumb on the scale a little bit. So again, that's going to vary from state to state about how they create the grant program and the scoring. So it makes it a little complicated, but.
And to piggyback on what Tom was saying about the variability from state to state, even Tom just a couple of minutes ago mentioned he had that list of where every state is at and that his list is a week old. And so who knows what changed. I would just encourage everybody to take some time today even and figure out where you can get the information for your state in particular and bookmark that website and just make it a point, every 3 or 4 days or once a week to go back and just make sure you're keeping up with what your state in particular is doing and pay specific attention to what deadlines there are in your state for what they're doing. And
probably your state broadband office has a email sign-up list to get notifications from them. That's a good thing to be part of as well.
That's a great tip. And really, that was a lot of useful information. So thank you so much, Tom and Kim, for sharing your expertise with us and great overview.